Just we need more time. 2 o'clock.
Yes, we should keep going.
Huh?
We should keep. I can do that. I can try the ceremony. I mean, I can try my solo thing.
Do your solo. Start again?
Yeah, let's do the first one.
Okay. Put my music away already.
Okay, we'll begin. On behalf of Laney, Phil's brother, Jake, sister Helene, I want to thank you all for joining us today. We come here together to celebrate the life of Phil Rubinstein and to reflect on his immense contributions to each of us personally and to the future of humanity. And perhaps each of us today, this afternoon, can become conscience-struck in thinking of Phil's heart, of his extraordinary personal qualities, and perhaps we can leave today, each of us, better people than when we arrived. Let me mention something, a note on safety. We ask that everybody continue to wear their masks. The chairs, you'll note, are 6 feet apart. Please continue to respect social distancing. And please, everybody, turn off your cell phones. In today's program, and everybody should have a copy of the program, for those watching at home, the program is available for the afternoon. After the section called The Arc of Phil's Life, those who are seated here who are coming for the first half will be asked to leave quietly so that others can then attend. So now we'll begin with a contribution from Hans Frederick Brobjerg. And you can follow along on your program on page 3.
From the tombstone of Hans Christian Andersen. Den sjæl Gud i sit billede har skabt, er uforkrænkelig, kan ej gå tabt. Vort jordeliv her er evighedens frø. Vort legem dør, men sjælen kan ej dø.
den Fliehen des Lebens bunte Szene und der Vorhang rollt herab. Aus ist unser Spiel des Freundes Tränen fließet schon auf unser Grab. Bald vielleicht mir weht wie Westwind leise eine stille Ahnung zu, schließlich dieses Lebens Pilgerreise fliege in das Land Schenk auch du dein Tränchen mir und pflege mir ein Pfeilchen auf mein Grab und mit deinem seelenvollen Blicke sieh dann sanft auf mich herab, sieh dann sanft auf mich herab. Weih mir eine Träne und ach, schäme dich nur nicht, sie mir zu wein, oh, sie wird in meinem Diademe dann die schönste Perle sein, oh, sie wird in meinem Diademe dann die schönste Perle sein. Sie wird die schönste Perle sein, die schönste Perle sein.
We will now have a contribution from Helga Zepp-LaRouche, chairwoman of the Schiller Institute.
Dear Leni, dear friends of Phil Rubinstein, we are gathering here today to honor our great companion, teacher, and friend Phil Rubinstein. I can't help to think that at a moment when the whole human civilization is in such a fragile condition, that the world must suffer the loss of such an exceptional person like Phil, who was one of the very few people who had a deep understanding about the scientific ideas of Lin, which are so crucial for the world to overcome its present situation. Well, Lin always said that to me, that he thought that Phil was completely integer. He was one of the most reliable persons. He would always try to get at the essence of the scientific ideas and making them intelligible for everybody. He had no respect for academic formalism or academic personas. He was actually a kind of Socrates who made it his life vocation to teach and educate the youth. His writings are very important, but even more important was the direct impact he had on hundreds and over the decades, thousands of people whom he introduced to scientific ideas which would change their life and to Lin's method of thinking. He was always concerned to look for breakthroughs in the real science, and he would not get stuck in questions of mathematics or molecular biology, where science has been stuck for a very long time. Phil made it his mission to communicate effectively the knowability of Lind's idea that creativity per se is the essence and the substance of the universe, because the human mind is not outside the universe, but it is the most developed part of that universe. Phil also had a very clear identity and understanding of the role of imagination in scientific breakthrough. That is because he had no fear of formalism, and especially in the foundation of the organization in the 70s, he had an absolutely crucial role. And it is not an accident that there are still so many people from the original Buffalo local in the organization. He had no respect for scientific bluster, which some people at that time clearly had, and also not for the effort to get lower level influence. And it soon would turn out that those people didn't have the strength to stay within the organization. So Phil played an absolute crucial role also in the recruitment of the LIM, the LaRouche Youth Movement at the West Coast and beyond. Phil was, and everybody has funny stories about that, was an absolute expert in the animal kingdom. And he knew the behaviors of many different animals very, very in detail. He knew what skills these animals had, but he also was never getting tired to emphasize that there was a fundamental difference between all the animal species and the human mind. He, from the same standpoint, rejected the idea that it would be possible at any moment that artificial intelligence or computers would bypass human creativity. If you read the beautiful Festschrift, which was pulled together for this occasion of the memorial, and naturally to pay tribute to Phil's impact on people, you can actually see how much impact he had on people and how much love he caused them to experience for him and for humanity. Phil had the kind of leadership, represented the kind of leadership where he was leading through inspiration and never emphasizing his rank or his importance. Everybody who knew Phil was convinced and spoke of the absolute deep goodness of his character, the gentleness of his soul. He was incapable of any nastiness. He had a very genial absence of any ego. He was humble in his manners, yet very bold in his intellect. Together with Leni, they had a very exceptional relationship and marriage. There are many marriages which are good or even excellent, but there are those where the couple is becoming almost one because they are becoming so complementary in the way they think. And that is for sure the case about Leni and Phil. And that was known around the world, from Taiwan to Denmark, from the north to the south. And I could name a couple of such extraordinary couples, but without doing that, I want to already put Phil and Leni on such a short list. It is very clear that we cannot replace Phil, but we can honor his contribution to the LaRouche movement and mankind by striving for scientific and artistic breakthroughs and reach out to the many young minds around the world with the solemn commitment to pull back the human species from the abyss where it finds itself at this moment. We will miss you, Phil, but you will always be alive in our fight.
Now we will hear something more than a Yiddish lullaby.
Schlanger in a Winkelchede sitze die Almona Bastian alle. Ihr ben Jochide Liedele ich sie gesehne und singt ihm zum Schlafen a Liede lasche. Und Herr Ide las Wiegele steht a Klol weiß Ziegele das Ziegele ist gefahren Handle das wird sein dein Rozhinkes mit Mandlen. Schlaf, Jaidela, schlaf, Alliluliluli. Das Ziegele ist gefahren Handle. Das wird sein dein Baruch. Rozhinkes mit Mandlen. Schlaf, Jaidela, schlaf, schlaf, Jaidela, schlaf, Alliluliluli.
We will now have a contribution from Harley Schlanger.
Dear Laney, Richard, dear friends and colleagues, when I think of Phil Rubinstein, our beloved colleague and mentor, our friend and counselor, two Yiddish words keep coming to mind. Two words with both a simple meaning when applied to everyday life, but words which also contain within them the shadow of the infinite. These two words are tsuris and nachas. The simple definition of tsuris is the pain and suffering one experiences in daily life, the troubles, the woes, the grief and aggravation, which are often our everyday companion. Tsuris is experienced when we have setbacks, as when our efforts to find solutions to difficult problems are dashed, or when we or others fail to live up to our expectations, or as today, when we are confronted with the loss of a loved one. Nachas is defined as proud pleasure or special joy, such as that which accompanies seeing the first glint of understanding in the eyes of a baby, when watching a child learning to read or play a musical instrument, as there is a glimpse in that moment of a future potential which warms the heart of any sentient adult. In everyday life, these two emotional states, which seem to be such opposites, often coexist. We learned this from Sholem Aleichem, who provided profound insights into the human condition through the eyes of the poor dairyman Tevye. Tevye had 7 daughters. An additional source of tsuris was that he must provide 7 dowries if he wished to see them properly married. Oy, one can hear him sigh from the milk wagon pulled by his lame horse through the rutted roads of the Russian shtetl of Yehupitz. "What's a mensch to do?" he said, followed by a wistful, "Ah, but such is life." With Phil, these moments of tsuris in everyday life involve such perplexing problems as how can we pay the office rent and taxes and still have enough money to feed the 50 or so youth we have recruited. And Nachis resulted when he saw those 50 or so youth recruit another 50 youth, of course, bringing with them future tsuris. But with Phil, the higher meaning of these two concepts was ever present in his search for the meaning of human existence, which was the real subject of his classes and briefings. Both contain within them a deep longing for a better world, even as we know that such a world will still contain hardships and challenges, and sometimes even bitter disappointments. But it's a world which can always be changed for the better through the action and development of human creativity. To me, it is clear that Phil discovered that there is both tsuris and nachis in his lifelong investigation of the struggle of human beings to advance from a simple hunting and gathering society to our complex world today, a history which includes great tragedies of awful suffering, many of which could have been avoided had wisdom prevailed, as well as great universal triumphs, which were also the subject of his classes, such as the defeat of evil by the Allies under Franklin Roosevelt's leadership, which ended the Second World War, or the footsteps left by American astronauts in the dust of the moon. Phil was fascinated by the full scope of the three phase spaces that we know of, the non-living, the living, and the noetic, and by the dynamic interaction between them. His hunger for discovery was insatiable to the last days of his life. And he took such great pleasure in sharing with others what he had learned, not just as presenting facts or plausible explanations of historic events or scientific discoveries, but in providing insights into the workings of his mind in total intellectual honesty as he struggled to get to the inner truths behind these developments. Even as we burst into laughter as he described such things as the war between eternal enemies, the hyenas and the lions, and mocked the irony that Californians would turn to an ego-driven Austrian bodybuilder to address a $30 billion budget deficit. We marveled at his tenacity in investigating the nature of the concept of the infinite, his rigor in tackling the difficulties inherent in Gödel's proof, or Einstein's theory of relativity, and his patient willingness to provide others with the method of his own discoveries. As Helga had mentioned, he didn't just teach us about Socrates, but he provided a living example of the Socratic method. In this process, even as we sometimes had to struggle to grasp the ideas he was presenting, we were moved by his humble nature and his generosity of spirit. Many have shared their stories of watching Phil at a cadre school, polemically challenging young people long after midnight by the dying embers of a bonfire in the mountains, passionately demonstrating his commitment to their development and showing to them that they could overcome the degenerate society which was all around them. As in the example of his mentor, Lyndon LaRouche, Phil cared little for the societal norms that defined success. Lynn had a standing joke about Phil, referring to Phil as a Luftmensch, which is a typical Jewish intellectual, thin, too poor to eat, but living on air. Phil long ago entered the sacred realm of the simultaneity of eternity. If one had an opportunity to spend time with him, you found yourself transported into the domain of infinite possibility. For in Phil, as in the case of Lynn, one experienced a profound appreciation for the Leibnizian concept that this is the best of all possible worlds. For him, this was not a slogan, but a physical, mental, and emotional reality, which included a profound challenge to each of us to make ourselves the best of all possible examples for those who work with us and those who will come after us. It is in this realm of the infinite expanse of time and space where Phil now dwells. We saw that even in his struggles with his health in recent years, he gave us everything he had. Along with his Lainey, for whom he had an infinite love, he touched so many of us, making us better people, as he prepared us to deal with the moments of tsurus and nachas we will encounter in our lives. I miss you terribly, Phil, but your living presence will remain an inspiration for me, and I know for many others who know you and others who will come to know you in the future. And for that, we shall be eternally and infinitely grateful.
Plenty good room, good room in my Father's kingdom. Plenty good room, just to choose your seat and sit down. Oh, plenty good room in my Father's kingdom. Plenty good room, just to choose your seat and sit down. I would not be a sinner, I tell you the reason why. 'Cause if my Lord was to call on me, I wouldn't be ready to die. Plenty good room, good room in my Father's kingdom. Plenty good room, just to choose your seat and sit down. Oh, plenty good room, good room in my Father's kingdom. Plenty good room, just to choose your seat and sit down. I would not be a backslider, I tell you the reason why. 'Cause if my Lord was to call on me, I wouldn't be ready to die. Plenty good room, good room in my Father's kingdom. Plenty good room, just to choose your seat and sit down. Oh, plenty good room, good room in my Father's kingdom. Plenty good room, just to choose your seat and sit down. Oh yes, plenty good room, good room in my Father's kingdom. Plenty good room, just to choose your seat and sit down.
Harley identified in his obituary, he identified Laney and Phil as a force of nature. Well, that force goes on and will go on here and hereafter. Laney had the idea of all of us, everyone who knew Phil, writing their reflections, their memories, their stories, and this generated this very beautiful, remarkable pamphlet booklet, which develops a life fully lived and includes the personal, very personal reflections of many on the impact of Phil's mind, Phil's morality, Phil's mission on the hundreds, and in fact, as we'll come to, on millions. I'll have much more on this, bit more on this when we come to Einstein. But Laney further asked us to, Laney pulled together pictures, which is what you will see on the screen, a few pictures to capture elements of Phil's life and the arc of his life. Roger and I, thanks to Laney, with Richard's assistance, can do some commentary on that. So what you see first on the screen, 1945, Atlantic City. This is Bess, who was born in the United States of Russian parents, and Ed, who came at the age of 15 with his family from Poland to escape Nazism. Ed served under MacArthur in the Pacific Theater as a cook. And soon after their return, they're hitched, they're honeymooning, and the best is yet to come. Bess with Phil. Jake, Helene, that's right? Good. Okay. This is Bess's mother, also with Phil. Is that right? Phil at 3. That's Phil there on the left with Ed, with his father, and that's Jake, who is sitting here. Came about 3 years later, and then Helene about 7 years after that. Now that's Phil's senior yearbook picture from Talmudical Academy of Baltimore, the yeshiva, high school yeshiva that he attended. And I want to read to you what was written about Phil in this yearbook. Anyone coming in contact with Phil immediately sees in him those characteristics which produce an integrated personality and begins to respect his inquisitive and probing mind. His vast stores of knowledge, encompassing every subject from science to English literature, and his down-to-earth way of doing things make Phil a solid citizen of our senior society. In his final year at TA, Talmudical Academy, he was editor-in-chief of The Torch, the newspaper, and started on the varsity basketball team. Yet he still found time to maintain the outstanding level of scholastic achievement which has made him a member of the Honor Society. Phil's next conquest will be nuclear physics, which he will study at Johns Hopkins University. And it actually indicates here he was sports editor, then editor-in-chief of The Torch, Honor Society, dramatics, JV and varsity basketball, and the picture is in here of him on the basketball. I didn't know. Softball for 4 years, it says here, and football. The main thing I knew, and I think many of us knew, was that he was a pitcher, and he tried out, I think, for a Baltimore minor league team as a pitcher. Fortunately, he didn't make it. But the striking thing on this is that he always had a baseball on his desk and was working on 2-seam fastball, 4-seam fastball. And Phil is famous for knowing earned run averages, batting averages for virtually everybody, certainly on the Baltimore team and otherwise, but he never had a basketball on the desk. So, Roger? So, I'll figure it out. So Phil received a Bachelor of Arts degree. Hello? Can you hear me now? So Phil did receive a Bachelor of Arts degree from the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Johns Hopkins.
and then went to the University of Washington in Seattle to study philosophy. Phil was actually on the verge of finishing his doctoral thesis and was planning to leave for Nairobi, Kenya, to study archaeology when he met the Labor Committee in 1968. In fact, he had already gotten all of the required shots for a trip to Africa. Talk about a life-changing event. In the program, you'll see Pat and Carol Ruckert describe some of their first encounters with Phil in June of 1970. Evelyn Lance, another early Seattle Labor Committee member, met Phil in 1971. And Pat Salisbury recounts that when Lyndon visited the nascent Labor Committee local in Seattle and got to know the, quote, strangely assorted potential recruits there, he made it clear that Phil was his choice to lead the local. This became one of the most successful recruitment centers in the history of the Labor Committee. And if anyone wonders why Phil was able to recruit so many youth in the 2000s, he had been doing it for 30 years already. Seattle was one of the largest locals in the Labor Committee, and in the mid-1970s he came to Buffalo, New York, where I joined, to run another of the largest locals in the country. Buffalo had been run by Ira Leibowitz and Tom Asher. Phil and Khushro Gandhi had both come in to deal with problems in the local. This was also a role that Phil played again and again. Now, if I do this right, okay. This is a picture of Phil with myself and Roger Moore. I think this is from about 1977. We took a fall and autumn trip to the Corning Glass Works in upstate New York. This picture was very dear to me and to Phil as well, I think. Buffalo was a big college town and had been a site for major anti-war demonstrations in the late 60s and early 70s. And this too became a major recruitment center around Lynn's ideas. We had locals in Rochester and Syracuse as well. And after the Buffalo local was shut down in 1981, Phil and many others of us moved to New York City.
Clicker. That's okay. Oh, that's right. Okay. Yeah, I just want to emphasize, this is before Laney comes into Phil's life. This is the period 70s into about 1984, and I want to emphasize what Phil did by quoting three of the people who knew him in Buffalo, in Boston, and in Brooklyn. I'll start with Brooklyn. Bob Wesser. And then there was Phil Rubinstein. Each week, the regional briefing would begin with all of the members dutifully taking their seats. Phil would enter the meeting room in the Brooklyn office and immediately begin roasting each member one by one. Don Rickles, move over. These roasts were so surgically insightful and hilarious that I remember literally being in pain from doubling over with laughter for usually 20 or 30 minutes, sometimes longer. I later realized that Phil would continue doing this and only give a briefing, so-called, after he was convinced that everyone was so loosened up with laughter and irony that their minds were actually working. And he goes from there. You can read the entire thing in here. Then, Mike Billington, who with various others was in Boston in the early 80s. The way Mike put it, you had, as they said, a band of brothers in Boston. There was Deborah Gelber with her husband, Mike Gelber, and then a bunch of bachelors. Mike writes in part, not that Phil was preoccupied with the sexual anxieties of our band of brothers, but neither would he lose the chance to induce self-reflection on the nature of man and woman. Just as he could spend extended periods of political meetings speaking apparently about the characteristics of gorillas or of the importance of pitching in baseball, and in the process provoke reflection on the creative process of the mind, so those riotous discussions of sexual fantasies left us all both happy and inspired to focus the mind on the actual mission. Of course, Mike Gelber was Phil's perfect partner in getting us all beyond psychoanalysis. And then just Dan Leach, who describes how he was recruited at his first meeting, I think, by Phil. I won't go. He said 1976. This is his introduction to Phil's shocking method to free and focus the mind. As Dan put it, with the complete dispassion of a clinical scientist, but an intellectual passion, a profound commitment to the welfare of others, and a willingness to put oneself into whatever messy or uncomfortable situation might be required. When you read Dan's full report, it is quite shocking.
My clicker's not, huh? Okay, great. Okay, so things really got moving in 1985 when Laney arrived fresh off the plane from Denmark and immediately was put to work calling black ministers in the New York City area as part of our organizing for our march in Washington of that year. She found Phil's briefings and insights instantly attractive and gave him a bouquet of yellow flowers on his birthday, January 18th, 1985, with a card signed by the whole office, to the Rose of the New York office. On Valentine's Day in the next month of the same year, Phil gave orchids to all of the women in the local. He later admitted that he did that especially to impress Laney. It worked. Phil and Laney would often go out for lunch or dinner to talk, but only with a chaperone. Phil had never even sat in a classroom with a girl until he went to college. Their one and only date was on April 16th, 1985. The rest is history. This is a picture, probably at the Speeds, in that period. And I'd like you to look at each individual in the photo and look at where they are all looking. Okay? Every single person is looking at the camera except for Laney. This is Phil with another one of our fallen comrades, Jerry Pineson, at a party at my place at that time. And this is Phil with Denise. So, Elliot.
In September of 1985, Helga directed Phil and Laney to come to Europe for 3 months, but to stay out of the offices. Helga told Phil that he was to learn where Laney came from geographically and culturally to ensure their relationship was a success. Phil initially thought Laney was almost perfect. As he got to know her better, he thought she was arrogant. But after 3 months in Europe, he realized that was just the European in her. Or the Dane? The European, okay. There's Phil. It's Germany. Okay. Germany. Right. There they are. What's that? Yes. There they are, enjoying their 3 months in Europe, getting to know each other. Okay, so Phil actually got out of the office eventually. He was known as, he was in the office most of the time. But here is Phil. This is campaigning for mayor of New York City, running against Ed Koch, 1985. And you'll notice that this is Chinatown. And the crucial element of that, one crucial element of that campaign was he was campaigning against the Bank of Hong Kong and Shanghai and drug money laundering and so on. A lot comes after this. This is now Phil running for governor of New York. Webster Tarpley was running for U.S. Senate. This is 1986. We'll go back a bit. This is the Koch campaign. Yeah, there's Koch in that picture. And Phil, and the press coverage in, I guess, September of '85. This is April of '86, after Fairchild and Hart, LaRouche candidates won major Democratic primary elections in Illinois. This was, of course, the moment that suddenly the blackout of LaRouche was transformed into tens of thousands of news articles across the nation. Here's a few, as Phil was running at that point in '86 for governor. New York governor hopeful backs Illinois candidates, and so on. What you see the headlines. Judah Rubinstein. Koch represents the banking and financial investment interests in the real estate industry. In any case, situated in terms of the explosion after the Illinois victories. Okay. This is the wedding of Phil and Lainey. That's August of '86. Is that right? And they are being married there by Rabbi Kaplan, who became a very important associate of ours, friend of ours, supporter, and so on. This is the wedding reception. That's Liliana Gorini.
Point at Dave.
Point at Dave, okay. Margaret here accompanying Liliana, and you'll see there's Lainey there. Is that Phil next to you? That's Phil. Yes, right. So you'll notice the Danish and American flags for those of you who didn't hear Lainey. And this is Phil and Lainey with Bess, with Phil's mother at that reception. Okay, Roger?
After the reception, the newlyweds took my car and all their presents to a secret location, a motel near West Point, and stayed in the President Grant room. Their favorite gift was a hat with two hands on it, which were colored like the Danish flag. Okay, red with white stripes. Were labeled Phil and Lainey, and when you pulled the strings, the hands clapped. Okay. In 1987, the FBI had shut down our office, and Phil and Lainey's apartment became our local office. Members would come and go all day long, leaving a mess. And Lainey not only had to clean up after everybody, but had no time alone with her new husband. One night around 11 p.m., Lainey had had enough and told a couple of members to leave. After they left, Phil sternly told Lainey to never talk to members like that. Phil could be tough, but never nasty. My wife Denise directed all of our performances of The Merchant of Venice in 1984 and '85. Dennis Speed played Shylock in the first performances, but he was unavailable for one of the later performances, and Phil, with virtually no rehearsals, stepped into the role. Here is Denise helping Shylock with his makeup.
When Phil went to the West Coast, Kushro wanted to make him feel at home. So This may be the only time Phil ever wore shorts, or that we saw in a picture. But among other things, the actual story of what Phil was doing on the West Coast is Kushro, who was the National Committee member out of Los Angeles, directing the work in the West Coast, called Phil and asked Phil to come out. This was Christmas of 1993. And when Phil arrived, Kushro greeted him. Perhaps they talked. He then proceeded to give him a key to the office, and Kushro left. Phil took over the West Coast, with Harley soon joining him there. So this is Christmas, New Year's '93. On January 11, Mike Elber tragically died in a car accident. Phil was here. Phil, as he did often, was the anchor that helped everyone to deal with that and other crises. I mean, he spent the next 15 years or so commuting. 20 years, 24 years commuting between New Jersey, Los Angeles, and other places. In the course of this, this is Phil in '98, back in New York State, campaigning for Keith Perez for U.S. Congress. Then what you have in that picture and in the subsequent picture is a hush-hush meeting for a week in Flushing, Chinatown, with a number of Chinese officials and intellectuals to study the ideas of Lyndon LaRouche. You see Lynn and Helga in there, Phil, Laney, Dennis Speed, Jonathan Tannenbaum, all attended and spoke. And this is Phil, is that Harley? Yeah. Phil and Harley working hard in Los Angeles. Santa Monica.
The first cadre school in California was in February of 2000, began an extraordinary period of recruiting essentially the second LaRouche youth movement. 18 youth attended that cadre school, and we have Maureen here as a legal witness to the story. We paid precisely $1,275 for the camp where the cadre school was held, rather than the very past due office rent of the same amount, and many other very past due bills. And that was always Phil's priorities. Laney was shocked when she first met Phil that he only had one pair of shoes made out of some kind of plastic, no winter coat, etc. Personal comfort and security were very low on Phil's list. The first cadre school in Seattle was in 2002. Oh, that seems to have. Yeah, but I think we may have jumped. We may have jumped one. Okay. All right, this is Peter Martinson and others with Phil in 2002. Also in 2002, Lynn came out to San Pedro to officially launch the international youth movement. And much to everyone's surprise, except Laney, 91 youth attended. In fact, before the event, Laney had told Lyndon that we expected 90 youth at the event. Phil and Harley both chewed her out for making such an exaggerated estimate that we couldn't possibly achieve. You should have seen Laney's face when the 91st youth came in the door. When someone suggested that Lyndon do a Beyond Psych series of classes on the West Coast, he said he didn't have time, and guess who? Phil should do it. Many of the messages in the booklet describe Phil's disarming ability to roast people for their flaws, but in such an honest and loving way that people could laugh at themselves and work on becoming better. Now, these are some of the pictures. That's the same event. But these are some of the pictures from the roughly 40 or 50 cadre schools on the West Coast from 2000 to 2010. And we now have a treasure trove of Phil's classes, as well as many other wonderful presentations from these events available on the WLYM website. Some of the people who attended these early cadre schools wrote in their messages that they often didn't really understand a lot of what was said at those first meetings, but they definitely remembered Phil. One of those remembrances was from Asika Burke, who wrote in a journal at the time, and I quote, "Phil is a deputy regional manager who obviously gets a smaller salary, just look at his skinny build, than the regional manager, Harley. And they run the LA office of the LaRouche movement, a family-owned business run by Lyndon LaRouche and his son, Lyndon LaRouche Jr. There's Amelia Robinson. There's Lainey, I can see her. Okay. Now, as part of building a youth movement is to deploy all of those people to help reach more people. And this was the scene out in the parking lot of the LA office with the huge amount of literature that was coming in to be distributed. And what couldn't fit in the parking lot fit just inside the doorway of the office. You had to be pretty skinny to get through the hallway.
It always looked like that.
This is a meeting in Oakland. And these are some pictures from 2004. Okay. Elliot?
This is a sight familiar to many. Phil walking and talking on his cell phone.
Forest Lawn.
Where is it?
Forest Lawn, that's a big cemetery.
Forest Lawn. Yeah. Then this is apparently Phil's birthday in 2006. You'll notice Courtney is back there. Then is this the, let's see, campaigning against Schwarzenegger, is that right?
Yeah, it's outside the Democratic Convention.
At the Democratic Party convention in California when Schwarzenegger was running for governor. Dave, you have something for us? It's here. So that actually, that's actually not Schwarzenegger, that's Alan Egray, as many of you remember. Okay. This is Phil, Rabbi Phil, presiding over the wedding of Dave and Siri Christie. This is Lainey having won a very intense legal battle to get her green card in 2011. It's a major legal battle. The picture was taken to send to Phil's mother, who was very interested in the outcome of this fight. She wanted Lainey to stay in this country, and I think she probably wanted Phil to stay in this country. Okay, then more recently, 2015, this is Asika and Daniel Burke before May, and Phil, the rabbi, presiding there. He presided over 4 weddings. 4 weddings. Okay, so this is Phil, I'm sorry. The Parkinson diagnosis was 2011, 2012. So subsequent to that, the point here being, Lainey refused to travel as she had been doing for many years to China and to Europe and so on. She refused to travel without Phil. And he did many things on those trips which you probably didn't know about. It's Phil with his niece in Denmark. Then he is using his skill from his pitcher days, teaching his nephew the fine art of baseball, 2016. Then this is Phil outside of Einstein's home near Potsdam. Lainey received a note this week which had a quote from Einstein's Credo, 1932. Einstein wrote, "Strange is our situation here on earth. Each of us comes for a short visit, not knowing why, yet sometimes seeming to divine a purpose. From the standpoint of daily life, however, there is one thing we do know, that man is here for the sake of other men, above all for those upon whose smiles and well-being our happiness depends." Einstein was one of Phil's intellectual companions. And Phil was prominent in Shauna's video, Shauna Halevi's video on Einstein. That video now has on YouTube 847,000 views. I opened it up this morning, and the first seconds of the video are Phil, first few minutes. And here's what he said. Said, "This is the product of the LaRouche youth movement, of Shauna Halevi, of the team under the guidance of Lyndon LaRouche, with the focus of bringing about a scientific revolution by redeveloping the methods that led to great scientific discoveries in the past, and that were part of a single unified idea of the creative nature of mankind. It is a nice irony that Einstein stood for this through his entire life as a moral, scientific, cultural, political fight, even in his later years when he was considered as a pariah for not accepting the new science that was irrational, that rejected the idea of a unified universe. Einstein kept the scientific culture alive for us, and this LaRouche youth movement to discover this unified picture of an anti-entropic development in the universe, to make the quality of discoveries of Einstein, Planck, Riemann, Kepler, and so on." I might add that this mission, this scientific revolution, as Lyndon was provoking it, will be Phil's legacy, among others. But this will be Phil's legacy with the future help of his friends, many of whom are here or listening today. This was, as he said to some of us in the middle of August, this was his new initiative It's actually a long time initiative, but he revived it and intensified it in the last hours, through the last hours, when he was extremely happy that he suddenly had access to a number of Einstein's works through the university library system. They came in that Saturday afternoon. Another video entitled 1932, A True History of the United States, in which Phil spoke repeatedly, standing in front of the Lincoln Memorial. This has now been seen by 1.2 million people. So that apparently a number of times Phil in Glendale or LA or whatever, not Hollywood, was recognized by passersby as those videos began substantial circulation. This is Phil speaking to economics students at a university in Taiwan in October of 2014. Phil with the two goddaughters, Wei Wei and Jia Jia, in Taiwan. And this is Lainey, well, those are the two goddaughters, right? Yes, Lainey and Phil, okay. Now they are standing, that's Taiwan, that's Taipei? Yeah. With Sun Andi, who is a former Central Committee member of the Kuomintang, and with Yu Feng, who has been translating Lin's major works into Chinese for decades. Yu Feng and Phil, Lainey reports that when Phil was on this trip, Yu Feng totally ignored her because she had access to Phil. Phil and Lainey speaking at a big teachers conference in Taiwan in 2014. This is now 2017. Phil, Lainey, Richard, and Marion spent a month in China. And this is Phil and Xing, their guide and translator, discussing astronomy at an astronomical museum in Beijing. Xing became a Columbia student the next year in New York and attended Thanksgiving dinner at both the Blacks and Rubinsteins in the subsequent, in 2018, 2019. Okay. Two Warriors in Xi'an in 2017. That is then a puppy named Peng Yo, helping Phil exercise last year. And then Phil with, what's happening? Okay, Phil with Peng Yo. This is on Lainey's 70th birthday? No. Oh, it's the next one. Okay, he's working with the puppy. Okay. That's on the 70th birthday. So.
Yes, we'll rally round the flag, boys, we'll rally once again. Shouting the battle cry of freedom. We will rally from the hillside, we'll gather from the plain. Shouting the battle cry of freedom. The Union forever, hurrah, boys, hurrah. Down with the traitors, up with the star, while we rally round the flag, boys, rally once again. Shouting the battle cry of freedom. We are springing to the call of our brothers gone before. Shouting the battle cry of freedom. And we'll fill our vacant ranks with 1,000,000 free men more. Shouting the battle cry of freedom. the Union forever. Hurrah, boys, hurrah! Down with the traitor, up with the star, while we rally round the flag, boys, rally once again, shouting the battle cry of freedom. We will welcome to our numbers the loyal, true, and brave, shouting the battle cry of freedom. And although they may be poor, not a man shall be a slave, shouting the battle cry of freedom. The Union forever, hurrah, boys, hurrah! Down with the traitor, up with the star, while we rally round the flag, boys, rally once again, shouting the battle cry of freedom. So we're springing to the call from the east and from the west, shouting the battle cry of freedom, and we'll hurl the rebel crew from the land we love the best, shouting the battle cry of freedom. The Union forever, hurrah, boys, hurrah! Down with the traitor, up with the star, while we rally round the flag, boys, rally once again, shouting the battle cry of freedom. The Union forever, hurrah, boys, hurrah! Down with the traitor, up with the star, while we rally round the flag, boys, rally once again, shouting the battle cry of freedom.
So now we'll begin our second half. We'll now have contributions from Jeff Steinberg, Bill Ferguson, and Dave Christie. Is Cody here?
Good afternoon, everybody. In thinking about how to speak to you all today about more than 40 years of friendship with Phil, compressed at Laney's request into just 5 minutes, I decided to go back and rewatch the 2008 LPAC video documentary, 1932. Phil and Harley and I worked with a whole team of wonderful people from the LIM, the Basement, and EIR on that project, and it was groundbreaking. So it was no surprise that I found Phil's own concluding remarks on the video to be the most appropriate words for this occasion. Phil said, and I'm quoting now, "Lincoln was assassinated. The British were out to kill him, and they did. In some ways, maybe that's easier to deal with. We should have kept Lincoln alive. But Roosevelt died. That seems to have been a random event. It leads to potentially a certain existential outlook. But what if we thought of it in a different way? No, he doesn't really die if we don't let him die. We have the ability as human beings to keep alive that which was unique about him, his mental capabilities, his discoveries, his social dissemination of ideas. If we keep that alive, as if the universe was the minds of people that we value, what they discovered, what they acted on as human beings. Going back to this idea that Roosevelt discovered, it was his person, not his physical being. Then their death would diminish them less. They would be more alive than us." Unquote. A young colleague and friend of mine who never met Phil in person told me upon learning of Phil's death that he and countless people of his generation, he's in his mid-30s, owe a profound debt of gratitude to Phil as their teacher and mentor. He wrote, and I passed along to Laney, quote, "Phil was one of my YouTube favorites. I found Phil's lectures on YouTube and watched many of them, often repeatedly. He was quite simply an excellent teacher, particularly in his ability to articulate complex mathematical and epistemological concepts to young viewers like myself with no background in these subjects. His engaging style, punctuated with humor, brought a concreteness to abstract ideas that made them so much easier to understand. The breadth of his knowledge was impressive. I regret that I never got to let him know how much I appreciated and benefited from his videos. But I thought it may perhaps provide you with a small measure of comfort to know that I am probably just one among thousands of young people that Phil inspired online and will continue to inspire. Just to underscore my young friend's point, when I watched 1932 again a few days ago, there had been 1,222,579 viewings on YouTube. More than most people I've known, Phil lived his life in the temporal eternity that Lynn so beautifully described in his prison writings. From the first time that we really got to know each other as friends and collaborators, it was actually in Buffalo, New York, sometime in the mid-1970s, in the midst of a crisis in the local. It was always clear to me that Phil was a unique person who was more open, more honest, more transparent than almost anyone I ever met. He reminded me of an Old Testament prophet. There was nothing I could not freely discuss with Phil. And that was as true the last time we spoke by phone just a few days before he died, as it was during our first long walk in the Buffalo cold 45 years ago. The 1932 documentary impressed upon me again that Phil was able to look inside the soul of Abraham Lincoln, a man whose works he read and greatly appreciated more than anyone else, perhaps. And Lincoln, in turn, provided a perfect commemoration of Phil's life and work in the final words of his second inaugural address, which Lincoln delivered on March 4th, 1865, just 42 days before his assassination. Quote, "With malice towards none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work that we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations." God bless you, Phil.
As many have noted, Phil was passionately determined, despite his debilitating illnesses, to continue Lyndon LaRouche's intervention in science. Phil encouraged me to participate in a weekly discussion group devoted to this task. 1 week before he passed away, he called me to talk about sparking more of our highly capable members to collaborate in this, and on outreach to scientists who desperately need LaRouche's scientific method. He called me 5 days later to make sure that the conference calls would continue every week, even while he was recuperating and couldn't participate. He texted me later for a report on that evening's discussion, but before I got back to him, he was gone. As I contemplate this natural philosophical mission that he lived for, and which he very clearly expects me and you to complete, I remember the evening in 1982 when Phil first shared with me a poem, The Phoenix and the Turtle, that now seems to distill the contents of our comradeship of 4 decades. Among other thought objects, Plato's Parmenides on learned ignorance, and poetry must begin to supersede mathematics in physics. In other words, paradox, humor, irony, and love. And it was mentioned Phil's love of studying animals. Well, you remember Phil loved birds. So this is the perfect poem for that. Let the bird of loudest lay on the sole Arabian tree, herald sad and trumpet be, to whose sound chaste wings obey. But thou shrieking harbinger, foul procurer of the fiend, augur of the fever's end, to this troop come thou not near. From this session interdict every fowl of tyrant wing, save the eagle, feathered king. Keep the obsequies so strict. Let the priest in surplice white, that defunctive music can, be the death-divining swan, lest the requiem lack his right. And thou treble-dated crow, that thy sable gender makest, with the breath thou givest and takest, mongst our mourners shalt thou go. Here the anthem doth commence. Love and constancy is dead. Phoenix and the turtle fled in a mutual flame from hence. So they loved as love in twain had the essence but in one. Two distincts, division none. Number there in love was slain. Hearts remote, yet not asunder. Distance and no space was seen twixt the turtle and his queen, but in them it were a wonder. So between them love did shine, that the turtle saw his right, flaming in the phoenix sight. Either was the other's mine. Property was thus appalled, that the self was not the same. Single nature's double name, neither two nor one was called. Reason, in itself confounded, saw division grow together. To themselves yet either, neither, simple were so well compounded, that it cried, how true a twain seemeth this concordant one. Love has reason, reason none, if what parts can so remain. Whereupon it made this stream to the phoenix and the dove, co-supremes and stars of love, as chorus to their tragic scene. Beauty, truth, and rarity, grace and all simplicity, here enclosed in cinders lie. Death is now the phoenix nest, and the turtle's loyal breast to eternity doth rest, leaving no posterity. 'Twas not their infirmity, it was married chastity. Truth may seem, but cannot be. Beauty brag, but 'tis not she. Truth and beauty buried be. To this urn let those repair that are either true or fair. For these dead birds sigh a prayer.
Do we have Cody Jones?
Hello, everybody. So, I'm sure many people have seen Phil speak and attended his classes, and they had a profound impact on many, including myself. But he'd always sort of approach the stage and always check to make sure he hadn't gained an extra pound or anything. I don't know why, of all people who would ever be concerned about their waistline, why Phil was, I don't know. But that was. Every time he'd step to the podium, we'd always sort of check, make sure this is all good here. Okay, then he'd put his watch up, say, I'm just going to be brief. Always this line. Of course, it was always at least an hour or so, but thinking now with his love of Einstein, it was more that the gravity of his mind perhaps slowed down his watch a bit. So for him, it was a brief time, but in many ways, it was also eternal. In the last years, probably Phil and I had had the closest portion of our relationship. Even though I hadn't actually seen him physically for, it's probably been 3-4 more years. We talked probably at least once a month or so, in-depth discussions. And I think maybe that's a testament also to his understanding of economics, that I guess he figured a lot of investment had been put into me, so he might as well sort of keep it going. Why let it go fallow? So, I mean, you can see in the booklet there some of my more sort of personal recollection of Phil, stories, things like that. I think maybe the best thing, just in a brief couple minutes, is to give a sense of what were the recent discussions that Phil and I had had and what he was investigating. As I said, intellectually, our relationship had grown much closer of late. Also maybe it had to do with so they weren't discussions that were sort of interspersed with trying to figure out which check cashing place would still accept our rent checks and this kind of thing, as we often dealt with out in California. But, Phil was he was passionate about keeping the tradition of Lynn and really bringing to life the LaRouche-Riemann method. And so a lot of our discussion of late had been on really trying to figure out, is there still some embers of hope in the current scientific community that could be brought to fire, that would represent some force that could realize the sort of mission and the sort of direction that Lynn and the movement had been pushing for, going back to the days of the Fusion Energy Foundation. And so Phil and I were constantly exchanging videos, talking about books. He'd say, have you read this book? Oh, no, I'll read that. I'd send a book to him, he'd read it, and we were really starting to flesh out what tradition still existed in the scientific world today that could be brought to bear on the kind of problems that Lynn was dealing with, that the movement was dealing with, and that Phil was intimately concerned with. And a lot of it centered on what was going on in the domain of quantum physics. Phil, I think, had always had a certain desire to understand what was happening with quantum physics, and in the last several years had really put himself to task of coming to understand what this strange language and this, what can often seem like a very mystical and goofy science, was all about. And he was starting to crack the code a bit, so to speak. And so where we were starting to get to is that we had started to find there are some current scientists out there. One guy in particular bases his whole theory on a revival of Leibniz's conception. And Phil was excited about that. Hey, there are actually people who are talking about Leibniz and keeping us alive. This is the tradition that produced the LaRouche-Riemann method. Then we were looking at certain questions around this idea of emergence, which has become a big topic in science and quantum physics. You know, the idea that you do have phenomena that can't be reduced to any smallest parts, or, you know, there's no reductionist way to get at them. You know, the most obvious one is things like life itself, the human mind, but then other things that you find in what's considered solid state physics, looking at the way that, you know, even resistors and crystals operate. There are certain features that seem to emerge as a process of organization is underway, but which you could never predict in any deductive way from just analyzing the pieces that make up that structure, that system. And so we're really starting to flesh out where an understanding of this was in the domain of science. And, you know, we can talk later, and hopefully some of what Phil wanted of this collaboration can be brought back together and really given some life. And we can, you know, we can get into some of who these people are, what's out there. And, you know, I just saw in Phil a real, he had a passion to make this work. You know, he really wanted to bring together the Vernadskian tradition with the Riemann tradition under the umbrella of physical economy. The idea of the creative human mind being that which is the essence of development in the universe. And Phil didn't just believe this, he knew it, he understood it. That's why he was able to live the life that he led, because he knew that creativity was truth, that creativity was the substance of the universe and was the substance of all human beings. And, you know, that's why I appreciate him so much. That's what he saw in myself, is that he wouldn't let that die. He continued to press and push to make sure that for myself personally, I held on to that truth and to that passion. And for that, I'm forever indebted to him and thank him for that. And I think the greatest thing that we can do for Phil moving forward is to revive again this kind of spirit that we had in the LaRouche movement, the youth movement, and really fight to realize an emergence of the LaRouche-Riemann method as a working principle in the world today. So I can say for now, thank you.
I would like to extend my deepest condolences and sympathies to all of you, all of us who are gathered to honor and ultimately celebrate the historic mission of Phil Rubinstein and his enduring and immortal legacy, both to his commitment to the mission of Lynn, but to the domain of ideas that Phil was so passionate about. Certainly my sympathies extend to Lainey, especially to Lainey, given the loss of her best friend and her life partner, who's, you know, their marriage was really a source of inspiration to many, certainly to my wife Siri and I, who had the honor of having Phil preside over our marriage over a decade ago. As well, I extend my sympathies to Phil's family, but to all of us who know this is a great loss, but also know that what Phil represented is something that we all aspire to in terms of his intellectual curiosity and really a passionate commitment to that domain of ideas, which was certainly one of his most endearing qualities. I think one of the other endearing qualities, at least to me, and I'm sure many of you recognize this, if not, I've already mentioned this, but certainly one of the most endearing qualities to me was Phil's selflessness, that in the midst of some pretty severe adversity that both he and Lainey faced and certainly weathered together, you know, Phil never complained. I I used to joke with him that he was becoming more and more like Job, which he would sort of feign a chuckle, but I could always tell he was slightly annoyed with the comparison, probably thinking that he was complaining too much, you know. But in checking in with him on the question of the Parkinson's, which, you know, really Laney and he absolutely weathered that storm together. I think that was an undisputable fact to all the medical professionals who recognized what Laney had done working with Phil on that front, or called to check in with Phil on the question of his need for the transplant, the kidney transplant, which he probably has some sort of a record for the number of people who lined up for it, or at least probably the geographical extent of people from around the country and probably from around the world that either did or would have volunteered their kidney for Phil. I guess John was the lucky winner of that lottery. I remember checking in with Phil after Laney had gotten mashed up by a Mack truck. But anyway, breaking number of bones in her bodies. And in the light of all of this type of adversity, I think Phil's biggest complaint was that he perhaps didn't have enough time, or was didn't have the time to engage in the type of reading and other intellectual endeavors that he was involved in, whether it was Leibniz or Einstein or historical studies that he was working on. And so that was probably his biggest complaint. And after about 20 seconds of that sort of complaining, he would quickly flip it back to me and ask how things were going with Siri, with Macy, with Mia. And he would always ask about Mia Bella, and he would give his Italian accent on that. But, you know, quickly he would want to turn to the question of what was I working on, and that to Phil was his passion. With everybody that he engaged with, he wanted to find out what they were thinking about. He wanted to engage them in a dialogue. He wanted to impart to them his sense of Lynn's epistemological method and the ideas that he had to share with people. But he was always interested in what people were thinking. In fact, that was actually one of my first indications that there may have been something wrong in terms of Phil's health. Was actually one of the last times that Phil made it up to Seattle to work with the crew up here. And on the way to the airport, we were engaged in some sort of was on Vernadsky. And at a certain point, expecting a response, I looked over and Phil was dozing off. And, I attributed that at the time. This was before we found out that he had Parkinson's, but I attributed it to a fairly intense schedule, or I was certainly no stranger to having put people to sleep in terms of presentations or whatever. So I sort of chalked it up to one of those, but it did bother me because, Phil in discussions with whoever was always engaged with that person, no matter how far off base they were. He wanted to find out what they were thinking and wanted to engage with them on a deeper Lynn's epistemological method. And I think it was, that actually was one of the last conversations with Phil where, his sense of that passion, no matter what adversity he faced, that he was committed to that sense of leadership around the ideas of Lynn, but around his own sense of what that was. And I think for many, Phil was an avenue for people who to get a sense of Lynn's ideas. Not, he had mastered those and had his own sense of continuing to master those ideas, and provided that for many in the youth movement, and continued to provide that to the emerging movement. But that was actually, one of my last conversations with Phil, where I sort of laid out my schedule of 7 days a week and many days over 12 hours. But after going through that, Phil still said, you know, I'm putting some work together on the science policy, and I want to call you back and see what you think. So that was my last conversation with Phil. It was emblematic of Phil's commitment to that and his sense of challenge to everybody that they live that same quality of pursuit, those same intellectual endeavors that he was so passionate about. So Phil, though we may all miss you, we know that you live on, and your sense of having challenged people, and you live on in the ideas that you have presented that live within all of us and live within your words and writings, and that is your immortal contribution. So until we meet again.
Sträuche blinkt und sein schlummerndes Licht über den Rasen streut und die Nachtigall flötet, wandrig traurig vom Busch zu
Well, my task is somewhat of an easy one, since if I'm at a loss for words, I have got Phil to lean on here. Phil did so much that it's very hard to pick out examples from his life. At least I find it that way, because he was just always there, always dependable, always someone you could count on. I know that I called him before every class I gave up to a few years ago. And his sense of commitment to a process, the confidence that he had to be able to commit himself to a process even in uncertainty about his own insights or about whether it could succeed, that commitment that he had came from a very deep understanding of the potential of the human being. His ability to listen, I think, is part of why his insights were so sharp. In addition, of course, to all of his study of animals, which unfortunately is helpful for understanding people at times. I'm going to go ahead and just turn it right over to Phil. He's going to introduce himself, and then we're going to hear a few excerpts from his many years of classes and presentations on economics, on organizing, on what it is to be a human being, on creative thought, and on immortality.
The creative capability of the species is what I might call, or what Lynn has called, a strategic necessity. This is not a question of it's nice to be creative and we all get to feel good once a week or twice a week, or maybe we think we're so good we're like that all the time. This is something that's a requirement for the existence of the human species. And in a certain sense, we have to get beyond a conception of ourselves as limited to our mortal existence, our sensory experience. If you're not thinking, even from the standpoint of a simple wage earner, of a certain concept of the way in which society is organized to reproduce you, you're not capable of thinking about what policies you need to support, what policies you need to be in favor of to guarantee the success of your family's ability to function into the future, of your children and your grandchildren and so on and so forth. We used to use the example people have heard before of the worldwide cup of coffee. Ask yourself what it took. We could use anything in this room, but ask yourself what it takes to put a cup of coffee on your table in the morning. What does it take to bring the coffee beans, the cup, whatever was used to make to brew the coffee? And of course, the joke is, if you really tried to trace this thing out, if you really included the ship, the truck, you realize it probably took most of the world to get that cup of coffee on your table. I mean, this is why people get very upset if you say you have to worry about the welfare of other people. Say, no, I got to take care of my family. You get this fearful reaction. The truth of the matter is, it's not a matter of sentimentality. It's not a matter of provoking in somebody the right feeling. The truth of the matter is, that's what it takes for you to survive, at least at the level you want to survive now. And frankly, if you tried to go back the way some people do, say, well, I'm going back to a primitive condition. I'm going to go back. Well, go ahead. Live in a tree. This is called globalization, really. But the problem is a lot of Americans have a real dense spot on this. Well, it's cheaper that way, ain't it? Doesn't it make it cheaper? I mean, now, first of all, how can you say cheaper? They outsource basketball shoes, and they cost you $140. You realize you're buying a shoe made by some poor kid in Indonesia or something, or some young woman in Indonesia is being paid $1 a day, maybe if she's lucky. And the entire amount of labor that goes into the shoe is, $1.50. It costs more to ship the damn thing from Indonesia to some store that you're at, and you end up paying $140 for it. But that's cheaper than if we had American labor, because then it would cost $250. And the average American buyer thinks this is a great deal. To a large extent, you're paying for the label. And some story that you can pump air into the soles of the shoe. I don't know. I'm not exactly quite sure what that's supposed to do anyway. You know. Well, I'd like to ask some of these guys that spent $140 and bumped somebody off to get the shoes, you know, can they really jump higher in these things, you know? Does it make white men jump better? I don't get it, you know? Okay? So, you know, I don't think I just think they think the label attracts people. I don't know what it is. But the truth of the matter is, this is used to lower living standards and wages on a global scale, at a point at which the entire economy is dependent on the ability to find sources of income, which then go into financial speculation. In other words, much of the underpayment of labor and the underpayment of costs, the underpayment of resources to third world countries is then used to prop up the value of financial instruments. It's David Ricardo, it's British financial speculation, it's rentier finance, it's got nothing to do with the with any decent economy. That's why I said the biggest problem is if people in the United States today went out and celebrated July 4th, it would be like celebrating Satan's birthday on Christmas. This idea of free market money, and the money is the value of an economy, is anti-human. It's anti-creative. And we never lived that way. We never did live that way. We lived by actual creative discovery. Society has to be built on the idea that we create in each member of particularly children, the ability to, the desire to be creative, to work at ideas. And that's where classical art becomes the key to it. Because you can't, a scientific discovery occurs over a certain amount of time. And it's the collaboration of a certain number of individuals. Problems come up, we discover technologies, we experience more of the universe. In classical art, you can take ideas and, in a sense, develop them as almost as though you're the creator of the universe of that idea, unfolding in the drama, in the poetry, in the music. And in a sense, you get a sense of the non-empirical. You get a sense of something that is outside of normal time, or what in theological terms is sometimes referred to as the simultaneity of eternity. You live in time, but you're experiencing the creation of something that draws you into its identity, that draws you, therefore, into the future. Where is this idea going? And so, in one sense, the creative artist, the composer, Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, Schiller, Shakespeare, they're developing a universe on the stage or in the poem, which unfolds an idea that you begin to think about before its conclusion. And you begin to think then about how that kind of idea can be unfolded in human history by communicating it to other human beings. And you're drawn to this, and you're outside of sense perception, because you don't see the future. You don't feel the future. You know what needs to be created for the human species to have a future. So it's not a mystical vision. I'm often inclined to think people talk about visions because it conforms to sense perception. You can't really communicate a vision in that sense. But you can communicate an idea. And therein lies the spirit of human beings. We have to organize from a much more strategic standpoint and always have that strategic picture in mind, because people don't operate on a one-to-one basis. So when you operate on a one-to-one basis and you ask yourself why I couldn't inspire this person, or why this person is not inspired by this series of events, the problem that you're facing is you're dealing with a single individual whose mental internal life, or the circumstances of their life before you bumped into them, you don't really know. I mean, you have to sort of recognize something. You don't know what's, you can sort of be angry at them for not being more responsive or more open to ideas, but you don't really know what shaped the nature of their response. Now, how do you approach that? On the one hand, you might find, and you're looking for the possibility, okay, I'm going to connect to this person. They responded. That's good. You have something to work with. Okay, but the question is, how do you determine that you're going to run into a certain number of people who do respond, who are open to the idea, who are open to a certain quality of change? Some of it may seem to be random. You're looking for, well, okay, you just happen to bump into somebody good. In one sense, it's not the worst thing to have that approach. Because if you're sort of a little bit humble, you don't know what's causing these people to react this way. Take, for example, the response that we got on the campuses often enough for a long time, the importance of understanding when there's an operation run against us. You're going out there, and people say, yeah, I'm not interested. And you say, well, they're not interested. What's the problem? Then they may even say something like, well, LaRouche is this. He's a bum. And you say, well, people seem to think this. As though it's a self-evident event. Okay? Then you realize, wait a minute. There was an article in the newspaper attacking LaRouche. Well, was this just a random student? Well, it turns out he's hired by the Ayn Rand Society or whatever. And then you realize that what you're running into is part of a consciously deployed operation that's meant to affect your efforts. Now, that's just one tiny example. Because there's a lot more of that goes on than you think. Then you think of the way in which the population is worked on all the time. You recognize that in a sense they're the victims of a mass effect organizing, which is consciously meant to turn them into what you run into. Okay? So now how do you deal with that? Well, you have to try to find the means to approach the area that you're organizing from the standpoint of a similar kind of mass effect. You have to change the environment in which you're organizing, not the individual. You'll change the individual by changing the environment, and in a certain sense, then you'll pop out a certain number of individuals who respond to that environment. That's what we mean. Now, what is the means that we have to create a mass effect? We deploy the literature, the numbers of people, the intervention into the community, and the quality of the effect of the organizing. So we use music, which has a profound effect on changing the environment. Now, once you've done these series, it includes interventions and classes. Once you've done these series of things, then you realize that you're talking to people in that environment. And now you're looking for the people who respond to that environment. And you will pop some of those people out. And I think, again, it comes back to the same thing. This is what we're talking about you organize for mass effect. You want to take the things that are going to be on people's minds and force them to elevate it to something else. And the virtue of the music is it has a certain universality. People will say to themselves, why does this make me respond differently? Because to a large extent, you do get a different response from people than they expect. Some people will just say, oh, I don't want to hear that, because they have an ideological response. And they say, this is classical, highfalutin music. But if we do it right, most people will say, this does something in my mind that I don't understand why. I want to find out why. And then you combine that with the literature, with the political intervention, with the consistency of our effect. And you realize that you're operating strategically by using the entire effect of the organizing to change the environment. And it's that kind of change in the environment that's required to bring the best out of people, to give them an environment in which their better selves can come out. And that's what it means. In a certain sense, that's what it means to be compassionate to people. It doesn't mean oozing over them. It means that you're prepared to be patient enough to let their better side come out, to let their humanity come out. You know, as Schiller says, treat them as they ought to be, not as they are. I'm not going to recite it. I'm not going to do that to you. But anyway. But he says, after the beat, he says, to die, to sleep, no more, and by a sleep to say we end the heartache and the 1,000 natural shocks that flesh is there. See, the first time around, he says, it might be a good thing. Peace, death, the quiet of the grave. No more to be bothered. But what happens? 'Tis a consummation devoutly to be wished. He's not afraid of death. To sleep, perchance to dream. Aye, there's the rub. For in that sleep of death, what dreams may come. When we have shuffled off this mortal coil, must give us pause. There's the respect that makes calamity of so long life. For who would bear the whips and scorns of time, the oppressor's wrong, the proud man's contumely, the pangs of despised love, the law's delay, the insolence of life, and the spurns that patient merit of the unworthy takes, when he might his quietus make with a bare bodkin? Who would fardels bear to grunt and sweat under a weary life, but that the dread of something after death, the undiscovered country, from whose bourne no traveler returns? So what is it that he's afraid of? Not death. That there might be something afterwards. That he might be held accountable for what he does. That he might break from what's accepted and be judged to have done wrong in the eyes of his peers. That's Hamlet. Hamlet is the opposite of something sublime. I'll come back to what this means. It's the opposite of the scientist who says, I should dare to hypothesize something that is unacceptable to my peers. I shan't go there. Let me formulate this in some way that doesn't offend, so that if I happen to pass this mortal coil, no one will be offended by what I did. And I won't have to pay the price afterwards. What do you get from the average politician? No, this cannot be said. This is unacceptable. This cannot be done. My favorite expression of this is, you can't say that. Say, Cheney's a fascist. You can't say that. You say, well, why can't you say that? A lot of people are going to tell you, well, you know, it's a small part of the market. The whole system is like this. This is the end. Well, LaRouche was asked a question by somebody at a webcast last week about taxing the hedge funds and, maybe controlling them a little bit. And he said, forget it. Time has run out. This system is finished. And we either move in to reorganize the whole thing, the way Roosevelt did, only better, in the 1930s, or we're going to be taken to hell by a rotten financial system. And it has happened before. Even though people like to think, well, no, they won't let it happen. Who are they? The people who made it happen. So why would you expect the people who made it happen to not let it happen? You see, this is where people like to think, oh, the big shots are going to handle everything. The big shots are not that smart, or we wouldn't be in this shape. We have to look at this question, what is the difference between man and beast? Are we simply a little more complicated? We're a little more aware. See, I think this is a big issue. Because everything that most people are taught, first of all, most people are increasingly taught there is no difference. We're statistically different in the sense that we're a little bit more complicated, that our neural effects cause a little bit more electric storms in our head than they do in dogs and apes and so on and so forth. But there's really only a statistical difference between us and animals. Chimpanzees can do a lot. And then you get this crazy stuff, which really shows you the kind of decorticated business, which is, well, what is difference between man and the animal? Perhaps we're aware of ourselves. We're sort of painfully self-conscious that we exist. And animals sort of aren't exactly aware of themselves. But then again, they've done studies on chimpanzees, and it turns out if a chimpanzee looks at a mirror long enough, maybe a day, it gets the idea that the object in the mirror might be itself. And therefore, it's aware of itself. Okay? And therefore, it has the potential to be aware of itself. So really, it's just, it just takes them longer to get the idea. Okay? Most of us don't really need a mirror, but it helps. Okay? Now, there's a point about self-awareness, but not in this way. Okay? Because it's really not that you're aware of yourself. You're aware of your relationship to the universe and other human beings. And you're aware of the grouping of ideas and assumptions that operate. And therefore, your self-consciousness of those things allows you to change those things. Now, the real question then becomes, what is it about human beings that's really different? That absolutely, you couldn't in any way, shape, or form ascribe to an animal. Now, for example, you get crazy things. I'll give you an example. It's always good to get the negative thing. Like, for example, tool making. Now, there's a point in tool making. But if it's treated as human beings began by making tools, stone tools or something like that. And, what's the image of this? Some long-armed pre-hominid or proto-human being, kind of a big brow, furry creature, kind of upright posture, walking along, stumbled upon a rock somewhere. It was so clumsy it fell down, and the rock split in such a way, and this creature said, "Aha! Maybe I can use that to dig something up or skin an antelope or something, And so there he was walking along with this stone, and he bumped into a dead antelope. This very clumsy creature couldn't walk upright all that well, and so as he fell down, the stone cut the antelope. And he said, "Wow, I can skin antelopes this way." Okay? And that was tool making. And then some clever guy comes along and says, "Well, chimpanzees make tools. They take twigs and dig for termites." Okay? They get the idea of crumpling up a leaf and scooping up water. Actually, the real point of this is, of course, a lot of creatures do things like this. It's not a big deal. Ravens, who are considered the geniuses of the bird world, okay, and they will drop rocks on eggs and things like that. In fact, they have some of these birds that will dive bomb eggs, basically, or things that are break. So they'll take a rock and they'll try to break a nut or an egg, and when it breaks, they eat it. Well, is that a tool? See, this is where people get hung up. See, they do this to you, and you sit there and you go, "Oh, geez, I guess we're not that good." You ever see the size of a raven brain? It's probably about that big. Size of a pea. Maybe an almond. Okay? And they say, "Well, see, it's just a funny kind of statistical difference. We can do more complicated things." Now, then the point is, okay, well, what is it? Because it's nothing like that. Frankly, the first stone tool makers didn't make tools that way. They actually had industries. They quarried. In fact, I would make the point that they knew certain kinds of principles. They did something that no other animal does. It's not even close. Of course, there's a sense of absurdity in this, really, when you think about the idea that you even are susceptible to this argument. You have to recognize some of the problems. Because, for example, how in God's name could you compare the discovery of the principle of gravitation, as Kepler did, with this raven dropping a rock on an egg? If you really let yourself think about it, you say, how did I get fooled that much? Because it isn't close. And part of what I think we'll hopefully get at tonight is what really is this idea of a universal principle. And why is it you can't reduce it to any formula, which I often hear from the questions. What's the formula? What's the formula? What's the formula? What's the formula for a nation state? What's the formula for what I should do tomorrow morning? And the problem is, the answer to most of these things is do what's human. So it's very important to define what's human, because that's the only answer to those questions. What's a human relationship? A lot of people, now want to know this, because, society's been so screwed up. We got such a wonderful, the Congress of Cultural Freedom and so on and so forth. You can't know. What does it mean to have a decent human relationship? In particular, what does it mean to have a relationship to a member of an intimate relationship with another human being? Now here we can get, is it mechanical? Or is it dynamic, Now, here's the problem. Here, let me pose this as a certain kind of funny problem. Because everybody wants to say, well, you want to really get to know the person. You want to have a real intimate relationship. And most people can't get away from the idea that means something about you-know-what. Okay? A lot of heavy breathing. Okay? And the heavier the breathing, the more dynamic it is. The more intimate it is. Actually, the more mechanical it becomes. Right? Now, but here's the question. What's intimate? What's human? Now, here's, by the way, where you get an idea why Lynn says you have to know Leibniz to understand the American Constitution. Because Leibniz talks about the pursuit of happiness. He talks about genuinely loving relationships. How do you get this? Well, what is it that makes somebody human? Human beings are defined by the fact that they are creative, they're cognitive, they're capable of generating an idea about the way in which the universe works. They are able to discover principles. And moreover, they're able to replicate because we're cognitive. And only a cognitive being can recreate the discovery made in the mind of another human being. Now, here's the interesting problem. There's nothing about that process that goes on in the mind of an individual human being that you can see, feel, touch, or hear. I mean, somebody can try to communicate it to you, but they're trying to communicate something that you can't see. You're never going to be in a position to kind of feel the discovery of a great idea. You can't open up the skull and watch the mechanism. There's nothing. You can't touch it. It's something that goes on only within the sovereign confines of an individual human being. It's invisible. It's unexperienceable. Now, how, then, do you have an intimate relationship to that process in another human being? And jokes aside, I assure you, there's no mechanical way to do it. There's no two things that go bump in the night are not going to discover this. Because what is it that the human being? See, everybody. What is it that the human being? See, the tension is, where is this going to go? Because it might take away a fantasy. Okay, wait a minute. Are you saying this? Are you saying that? Well, yeah. In one sense, I am. I'm saying most of what you think is intimate, chimpanzees do it. And frankly, at that level, you can't tell the difference. Okay? There's almost nothing that doesn't do it. Now, but if you talk, what is it that goes on? What is going on in the mind of somebody like Kepler when he discovers a principle of the universe? He's discovering something about the universe. What's his relationship? His relationship is to the universe as a whole. Now, is it possible then to know Kepler intimately? Well, how would you know him? You would replicate his relationship to the universe. Now, to a certain extent, and I think there is one thing you can do, to a certain extent, I would argue that if you replicate what Kepler does in his discovery, you have a more intimate relationship to Kepler than you do to something that goes bump in the night. This sometimes causes problems in relationships. They say, well, wait a minute, you're more in love with Kepler than you are with me. And sometimes that's probably true. Okay? And in some ways, maybe it ought to be that way unless you can improve on that. Okay? Because, now, how do you do something? Well, then how do two people engage in that kind of relationship? How can they know each other's mind? As these things always get a little bit silly when people talk about it. But how would you really know each other's minds? Because you have two sovereign individuals who are essentially opaque to one another. There's no pairwise communication that's going to get this across. Well, how do you do it? You have to work on the same problem. If you have two human beings who are committed to working intensely together on the same problem, on the same mission, on the same improvement of the powers of human beings to act in the universe, in the course of that, in the course of working on those problems, you will get a relatively more intimate insight into the way that person's human mind works. Look, human history is disequilibrium. We grow or we die. We progress or we lose. That's our relationship to nature, like it or not. And you know where that came from? Nature. You got to face it. You can't say, we're unnatural. Nature produced us. So if we're a problem, complain to Mother Nature. In fact, nature produced us as a creation that was capable of interacting with nature, of learning how nature works, and thereby expanding our knowledge and relationship to nature as a whole. In a sense, that's our great mission. What's the advantage of reading the printed media? I mean, it can be junk. But at least in the printed media, in an essay, in a paper, you engage the other person's mind. He's got to try to figure out what you're saying in those sentences. In general, pictorial visual images, unless you really work at getting an idea across, you have to, in effect, in the visual media, you explicitly have to make the person stop thinking of the visual aspects of it. He's got to think that there's something behind the visual aspects that's the controlling element that is communicating an idea. Contrary to the information theorists, contrary to a great deal of what people thought of as 20th century scientific outlook, the whole point is the way you come to know reality is you act upon it. You're inside the universe. You're part of the universe. So what you're essentially acting on is how the universe is going to respond to your action, which is always based on a hypothesis about the way you think the universe works. And the universe may answer you and say, good, right, you knew what you were doing. Or the universe may say, a little off. You expected me to do this, and I didn't. But what does that do? That gives you an idea of correcting the way you thought the universe worked.
In some ways, the way we use the word energy is a little bit of a problem. Because energy is not really exactly a quantity. Energy is not a scalar. Energy is an ability to perform work, which means a reorganization of activity. And this is where people get confused about a lot of this stuff on green technologies. That's why Lynn uses the word energy flux density. Because you can produce a lot of energy that's spread over a broad area. And you can move certain things with it. But you can't, for example, penetrate, for example, a piece of armor. You know, if you took a 1,000-pound wall and moved it 1 inch a minute, there's a certain amount of force in that. But it ain't going to do much to anybody. You take a couple of ounces of lead and shoot it at 1,000 miles per minute, you can do a lot of damage. There's energy, that's a crude example. You can think of a knife as an example. Because what is it that the ability to create steel or stone that has a sharp edge? You take the same force and you can cut something you otherwise couldn't cut. So the ability to produce a lot of energy may not be transformable into change, into work. By the 1950s, we already had fusion projects in very initial stages at places like the Princeton Plasma Physics Laboratory. This was known, obviously we knew something about fusion from the hydrogen bomb or the thermonuclear bomb. We certainly knew that a fusion process a lot smaller than the sun was possible. By the 1970s, we had programs, more programs than we have today, to develop fusion power. Now, what was fusion power, like the nuclear bomb, based on? It was based on a discovery of principle by the aforementioned Einstein. And what was that principle? It was interesting because I think it's a principle that violates sense perception in two forms. It was based on relativity theory. Now, most people have a bad idea of relativity theory because of the word. I mean, even Einstein at a certain point didn't like the word because people think, well, it's subjective. What Einstein said was everything, it depends on where you're looking at it from or how fast you're moving. That's not what Einstein did. What Einstein did was actually go outside of subjectivity because he said, given that we know we can't have an absolute measurement, how can I reach the standpoint of finding what doesn't change amongst all the different viewpoints, amongst all the different possible frames of reference, as he refers to them? What's invariant? What doesn't change? What's the underlying principle? And the same thing goes for general relativity, at which point you go beyond the visualizable. Most of modern science today is not something you could visualize, or most of the frontiers. These are concepts, and they're not mathematical concepts. They're concepts, as Planck and Einstein identified them, of a certain kind of imagination. And it's an artistic imagination. It's an imagination within which the new idea performs the act of reshaping the entirety of our conception of the universe. So it has to be an idea coherent with that reshaping of the universe, with that redevelopment of our conception of who we are, of how the universe works. And so these things are something of the creative or the artistic imagination. The 20th century was largely the loss of the idea of human creativity. From the firing of Bismarck to World War I, to the attack on Planck and Einstein by Bertrand Russell and Niels Bohr and company, the introduction of pure reductionism, of logicism, of artificial intelligence, of the idea that computers can think. We've had a miserable, dark age with respect to the human mind. We've had mass killing on a scale unheard of, and we're about to make that look petty. How long does it take to raise a generation to a new skill level? 25 years. All investment of human activity has to be on 25 and 50-year and 100-year scales. When they began the rail project in the United States, people began that knowing that the project was going to take more than their lifespan. That's something that's lost in this culture. It's frankly, it's probably to most people in this room, it's a little bit of a freaky thought. Aren't you supposed to get what you can while you can? I mean, how do I think 25, 50 years? I can't think 25, 50 years backwards. How do I think 25, 50 years forwards? But of course, if you don't think that way, your life comes to nothing. In fact, there is no idea that is really worthy of the connotation idea that isn't essentially an idea about the universe as a whole. That isn't essentially a principle or a means of acting on the universe. The purpose of a nation is to create human beings who both have the sense of identity of acting that way and of creating the conditions under which human beings are capable of acting that way, of adopting those kinds of missions, of carrying those missions forward, and of generating that in other nations. That's the common good. Now, the other element of this is it's always about the future. It's always about a relationship to a sequence of development from the past to the future. It's always about what do we need to do today to make something happen 25, 50 years from now as best as we can understand it. So the mission orientation, in effect the universe that you're acting on, has a minimum horizon of a couple of generations. In a sense, you always have to think past the point that you're going. And as Lynn said, I thought this was ironic in the best sense. He said, the one thing you can't control is your mortality. In a lot of ways. You are what you are. Physically, you don't control that. I mean, a lot of people try to. But I'll admit, when it comes to physical matters, I mean, good exercise, good health, keep yourself in shape. But probably a lot of it is genetically determined. You know, how tall you are. You know, if you get the right nutrition and this and that, you know, maybe you could be 5'8" instead of 5'6". But it's not going to make you 6'6". Not unless you kind of go to one of these people who separates your bones and whatever. Okay? That is probably a combination of where you're born, and you don't have much choice over that, what you're born into, your mortality you don't have much control over. You know, and you know, without getting too existential, you know, most of us have a certain lifespan. Sometimes those lifespans are cut short for reasons that often make you wonder, but that's human life. You don't know when something's going to happen. You don't know what's going to happen. You don't really control that. Your mortality is completely contingent. But your immortality, you do have a certain control over. You may not have a control over how much time you have, but you do have something to say about what you do with the time you do have. Therefore, you can commit yourself to some kind of
purpose that extends beyond your time. You can decide to act on things that need to be solved. You can decide to act for political purposes to change the course of history. You can decide to act to bring ideas to other people. And even whether you have a long time or a short time, you've taken control in a certain sense of your own immortal purpose. That's within the realm of free will. All the things that people worry about really aren't. And they get all hung up about this. Well, how could there be free will? You know, I was born to certain parents. I was born in these conditions. And if you try to just sort of adjust that, you're not going to get very far. But you can determine what you do with your life. Now, that is what's embodied in the idea of a republic. What makes us human is creativity. Everything else is less than human. So we have to live by what makes us what we are. So the creative powers of every human being is to our benefit. Therefore, we wish to give people the opportunity to be creative, to develop their powers, to contribute to the future. You know, and this is our only immortality. I don't want anybody to leave here thinking immortality is somehow you're going to live forever. You're kind of going to float away, and your real substance is going to be out of this shade of pleasure and pain, the veil, you know, and somehow you're going to... No, the real trick is you know that you're not going to be around forever as an individual person. But the species has a possibility of being immortal. Not a given, but we're a species that changes, that controls our environment, that discovers principle. So therefore, we could do what no animal can do. We could be an immortal species. And your real purpose in life is not to, you know, not that everything is gray and so forth, but your real purpose in life is to contribute, to take the joy and pleasure of knowing you fought and contributed to that future. That in a sense, that's how you see something that is immeasurable in time. And that's culture. That's the way we can express this as individual human beings in classical composition, classical creation, really. Okay? I'll leave it at that.
for alt hvad du har klædt. Det om så det gælder, der er livet ej så svært, døden ikke heller. En digters sidste sang af Hans Christian Andersen. Løft mig kun bort, du stærke død, til åndens store lande. Jeg gik den vej, som Gud mig bød, fremad med oprejst pande. Alt hvad jeg gav Gud, det var dit. Min rigdom ej jeg vidste. Hvad jeg har øvet, er kun lidt. Jeg sang som fugl på kviste. Farvel, vær rose frisk og rød. Farvel, i mine kære. Løft mig kun bort, du stærke død. Skønt her er godt at være. Hav tak, o Gud, for hvad du gav. Hav tak for hvad der kommer. Flyv død hen over tidens hav, bort til en evig sommer.
On behalf of Lainey, Helene, and Jake, I want to thank you all for coming today. May we accept Phil's challenge. Stay safe and travel well.
Further along.